Hello, Adult Sunday School leader. One of the most beautiful truths in the Gospels is that Jesus never withholds mercy from those who come to him in faith. It doesn't matter their background, reputation, doubts, their pain. He receives them. Now, in Matthew chapter 9, we find three scenes placed side by side, and each one displays the same message. The mercy of Jesus is wide enough for outsiders, seekers, and sufferers alike. These stories show us that Jesus does not merely talk about mercy, he extends it personally, compassionately, and powerfully. And as we look at these verses, we're going to see that the invitation remains open today. Jesus still shows mercy to all who come to him in faith. Well, let's first look at Matthew chapter 9, verses 10 through 13. And here we see Jesus reclining at the table in Matthew's house. Now remember, in first century Jewish culture, tables were not like we have today. They were close to the ground. So people literally reclined close to the floor as they ate, similar to this picture. And when Jesus ate the Passover meal with his disciples, which we call the Last Supper, this is also how they partook of it. In John 22:14 it says, "When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table." You see, they didn't sit on one side of a long table in chairs, as is depicted in the famous Da Vinci painting. There were also many tax collectors and sinners who came to eat with Jesus and his disciples. And here's another cultural tidbit here, okay? Table fellowship was more than just sharing a meal. It was a sign of acceptance and relationship. So for Jesus to eat with tax collectors and these sinners, it was shocking to the religious society. Tax collectors were viewed as traitors. Of course, they worked for Rome, often overcharged people, and they were socially and spiritually despised. To the Pharisees, these people were beyond hope. Yet Jesus willingly sat, or reclined, at their table and ate with them. Now the Pharisees asked the disciples in verse 11, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Their question reveals a belief that holiness meant separation from broken people. The Pharisees were deeply committed to law-keeping, but their religion had become self-protective rather than compassionate, so they were noted for their separatism. They avoided sinners to maintain purity. Jesus, however, showed that true holiness moves toward brokenness to heal it. That's why he answered, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick." In other words, Jesus didn't come to congratulate, give a pat on the back to the righteous. He came to rescue the needy. And then he quoted Hosea 6:6 that says, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." You know, God has always cared more about compassionate hearts than religious performance. In fact, here are some other scriptures that echo that same thought. 1 Samuel 15, verses 22 through 23. Psalm 40, verses 6 through 8, Psalm 51, verses 16 through 19, Jeremiah 7, 21 through 23, Amos 5, 21 through 24, and the Micah 6, 6 through 8 that we just spoke about. So if you have time in your class, you might want to talk about these and show that it's not just a one verse. There's several verses in the Old Testament that go along with this thought. Well, Jesus concluded, "I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." If they had used punctuation in the early Greek text, I think there would be quotes around the word righteous. I don't believe Jesus meant that there were righteous people who truly were righteous there, but those who thought they were righteous and saw no need for Jesus. The self-righteous Pharisees didn't recognize their sinfulness, but the sinners saw their need. Mercy is extended to those who know they need it. Have you ever known any churches that took the Pharisees approach? You know, a church that shunned the downcast, looked down on the broken. You know, a hospital that refuses to admit sick people, it's not a hospital at all. And likewise, a church that closes its doors to broken people, they misunderstand the heart of Jesus. Once those who recognize their need for mercy receive it, they are called to extend it to others. So who in your life seems like they're an outsider and they need mercy? You know, Jesus would sit with them. Will you? Well, let's look on Matthew chapter 9, verses 14 through 19. Here the disciples of John the Baptist come with a question. Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples don't fast? Well, fasting was a sign of spiritual devotion, and they were confused by Jesus' different approach. And Jesus answered with a wedding illustration. He said that the guests of the bridegroom don't mourn while the bridegroom is present. His point was clear. His arrival was a time of joy, not ritual sorrow. There's going to be a time for fasting later, but right now, the Messiah is among them. He then added two short parables, a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment and a new wine in old wineskins. And both images say the same thing. Jesus did not come to fit into old religious systems. He came to bring something entirely new. And this wasn't Judaism 2.0 or the law 2.0. This was something new. The old system of rule-based righteousness cannot contain the life and grace that Jesus brought. Trying to combine the two would tear the garment or burst the wineskins. When I first went to seminary in Fort Worth in 1995, I purchased an IBM PC. It was about $2,000. I think it had a 420 megabyte, not gigabyte, 420 megabyte hard drive. Had two 1.44 megabyte diskette drives. You remember those square diskettes? And a 4X CD-ROM drive. Now, imagine if I tried to install some modern software on that old computer. It couldn't handle it. Similarly, Jesus is not an add-on to our old life. He is the beginning of a new life. Well, first century Judaism was built around traditions layered upon the law. And many hoped that the Messiah would simply become another teacher in that system. But instead, Jesus revealed that he was inaugurating a new covenant, a relationship based on grace rather than law, and rather than law keeping. In fact, Jesus came to establish three new things. A brand new covenant. Okay, this was a new arrangement between God and mankind, replacing the national covenant with an international one. This would be a new arrangement, a replacement for the old one. Not an addition, but a replacement. And this is keeping with Jeremiah 31:31, that where God promised a new covenant. He also established a new command. Now this was the main point of contention here. Jesus took 600 plus commands and reduced them down to two. Love God, love others. And then he took and reduced it down to one, which we call the Great Commission, which is go and teach all nations what I've commanded you. Not what Moses taught, and not just to the Jews, but go throughout the world. And this single command would then serve to usher in the brand new movement called the church. Well, many people want Jesus as a helpful addition rather than a transforming Savior. They want to keep old habits, old pride, old control, but mercy not only forgives, it renews. So the question to ask is, have you allowed Christ to make you new, or are you trying to fit him into your old ways? And a good way I like to illustrate that is a piece of the pie versus a hub. So we have a circle, and let's call this a piece of pie, and we have all these different segments, and we have work and home and family and hobbies and Jesus. Okay, we've got all these different things in our lives. And a lot of people think of a relationship with Jesus as just part of their life. That's a start, but that's not where we should be. Now, compare that to a hub, where Jesus is the hub. And based on our relationship with Jesus, it transforms the way we operate in our family and operate at work and which hobbies we do. And it's the center part of our life. That's the relationship that Jesus wants with us. Well, as we look on to Matthew chapter 9, verses 23 through 26, we see our final scene that shows mercy in action. Now, Luke 8 and Mark 5 also tell this story, and they actually add a lot more detail. A synagogue leader's daughter, this is Jairus, Jairus' daughter has died. Jesus goes into the house, and there's professional mourners there. Okay, that was kind of the thing back then, especially with somebody with this stature, the status that the paid professional mourners were there, and they were wailing. But Jesus said, the girl's not dead, she's asleep. And of course, what happened? The crowd laughed at that. That's just crazy talk. He then took the girl by the hand, and she rose. And he didn't say any magic words or perform any incantations. Mark 5, verse 41 states that Jesus simply said the Aramaic phrase, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, get up. Now, touching a dead body made a person ceremonially unclean under Jewish law. But let's remember what happened as we look in the other scriptures that go along with this in Mark and Luke. Right before this, he had touched that woman with the issue of blood. He had healed the demon-possessed guy. So Jesus is not made unclean by death or these other things. Rather, his life overcomes death. And as a result of this miracle, word spread throughout the region. So what we must remember here is that before these verses, the Father came to Jesus in faith, believing that if Jesus would lay his hand on his daughter, she would live. And then the verses in between, a suffering woman touches the edge of Jesus' cloak and is healed. And Matthew weaves these miracles together to show faith reaching for mercy and mercy responding with power. Jesus' mercy doesn't only forgive sin, it meets physical suffering. It meets emotional grief, and it meets hopeless situations. Sometimes his mercy delivers us from the suffering, but more often, his mercy delivers us through the suffering. Some today feel like hope is dead. A relationship, a dream, a health diagnosis, a spiritual struggle, it may feel like that's beyond repair. But mercy is not limited by what we think is final. Faith brings us to Jesus, and mercy meets us there. Now, across these three stories, across these three scenes that we saw, we see one continuous message. There is mercy for the outsider who's invited to the table. There's mercy for the seeker who's invited into new life. And there's mercy for the one who is suffering, who's lifted from or through despair. And the overarching truth is clear. Jesus shows mercy for all who come to him in faith. No background is too broken. No tradition is too rigid. No suffering is too deep. The question is not whether mercy is available. The question is whether we will come to him in faith. Well, next week we'll be in Matthew chapter 10, exploring the theme, loyalty tested. And our study is going to begin with Jesus telling his disciples, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. And then it concludes with his sobering words, I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. Even though this sounds a little ominous, it's a powerful passage that will challenge and encourage us. So thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate you. Don't forget to pray for and with your class.